their covenant.
We celebrate our resilience, our rich heritage, and our unwavering spirit.
Africa demands justice.
Justice that encompasses a comprehensive range of measures.
Because its children continue
true liberation.
The meeting in the executive boardroom is about to start. La réunion en salle du Conseil exécutif va reprendre.
Recording in progress.
The meeting in the executive boardroom is about to start. La réunion en salle du Conseil exécutif va reprendre.
Merci d'accueillir la présence parmi nous de son Excellence, professeur Robert Doucet, ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République togolaise. Avec votre permission, Monsieur le ministre. Donc, Excellence, Monsieur le ministre des Affaires étrangères, de la coopération, de l'intégration africaine des Togolais de l'extérieur de la République togolaise, Monsieur le ministre délégué auprès du ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République togolaise, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, représentants permanents, Madame la directrice de la division thématique des procédures et des procédures spéciales représentant le Haut-Commissaire des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, distingués invités, Mesdames et Messieurs. Au nom du professeur Robert Dossé, ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République togolaise, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette rencontre, malgré la pluie, organisée conjointement par l'Afrique du Sud, le Ghana, le Togo et la coordination de la CARICOM sur la question de la justice réparatrice aux Africains et aux personnes d'ascendance africaine du fait de l'esclavage, de la traite et de la colonisation. C'est pourtant un principe basique de la morale qui est bien connu. Un dommage subi mérite réparation. Mais le cas des atrocités causées par l'esclavage, la traite transatlantique et la colonisation semble depuis toujours échapper à cette logique. La présente rencontre, à travers ces discussions et surtout ces recommandations, essaiera de contribuer à l'avancement du processus de réparation. Avant de commencer, permettez-moi de vous donner quelques informations pratiques. Cette réunion se déroulera en interprétation simultanée en français et en anglais. C'est aussi une réunion hybride. Certaines interventions se feront en ligne. Les restrooms, les toilettes sont dehors de part et d'autre des escaliers et les sorties de secours sont juste derrière moi, mais je vous promets qu'on ne va pas les utiliser. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen,
Distingués délégués, mesdames et messieurs, la réunion d'aujourd'hui se divisera en trois parties. Une cérémonie d'ouverture suivie par une pause pour la photo de famille. Ensuite, nos deux tables rondes et discussions. Avec la permission de son Excellence, Monsieur le ministre, nous allons commencer la cérémonie d'ouverture et j'ai l'honneur d'inviter son Excellence Abdallah Saleh Poussi, ambassadeur représentant permanent de la République unie de Tanzanie à Genève et président du groupe africain qui va procéder à la modération. Excellence, vous avez la parole. Merci infiniment. Honorable ministre, Excellence, Mesdames et Messieurs, bonjour. C'est un très grand honneur. Au nom du groupe africain, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette cérémonie d'ouverture. Aujourd'hui, nous nous rencontrons dans un esprit d'unité et d'engagement collectif pour réaffirmer notre détermination collective pour nous adresser à l'héritage de l'esclavage, du racisme et toutes formes de discrimination. Nous nous rencontrons également pour célébrer le courage, la résilience et la contribution des Africains et les peuples d'ascendance africaine partout dans le monde. Les discussions commenceront aujourd'hui, pas uniquement, ça ne concerne pas que l'histoire, ça concerne la justice, l'égalité et la dignité de toute l'humanité. Il s'agit de veiller à ce que les blessures du passé soient reconnues et guéries à travers des actions significatives et que nos enfants héritent d'un monde guéri et basé sur la justice, le respect et la solidarité. Nous avons le privilège d'avoir parmi nous un panel de distingués intervenants dont le leadership et l'autorité morale continuent d'inspirer ce mouvement mondial, planétaire. Permettez-moi donc de présenter d'abord Son Excellence Je ne vais pas dire le prénom. Donc, l'ambassadeur Nkosi, ambassadeur et représentant permanent de la République d'Afrique du Sud. Monsieur l'ambassadeur Nkosi est un diplomate de carrière qui a servi d'ambassadeur de l'Afrique du Sud en Belgique et au Luxembourg et a représenté son pays à l'Union européenne. Son dynamisme a fait avancer la politique étrangère de l'Afrique du Sud, notamment en combattant le racisme, la xénophobie et toute forme de discrimination, et en défendant la déclaration et le programme d'action de Durban. Tout cela est bien apprécié. Ensuite, nous avons son Excellence, M. Emmanuel Kwame Asiedu Antwi, ambassadeur représentant permanent du Ghana à Genève. L'ambassadeur Antwi est également le coordinateur du groupe africain dans le domaine des droits de l'homme. La République du Ghana joue un rôle de premier plan dans la justice réparatrice en faveur des peuples africains, des personnes d'ascendance africaine. Son Excellence, le président John Dramani Mahama du Ghana, je vais passer à la troisième personne que je présente, Madame Anne-Catherine Lassaigne. J'espère avoir bien prononcé son nom, ambassadrice et représentante permanente de la République d'Haïti à Genève et actuellement coordonnatrice des États membres de la communauté des Caraïbes, CARICOM. Avant sa désignation ici, sa nomination ici, elle était chargée d'affaires à Genève et au Canada. Haïti et la communauté des Caraïbes est vraiment engagée pour la cause de la réparation, ce qui donne de l'espoir. Nous avons l'honneur d'avoir sa présence. Ensuite,
Director of Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and the Right to Development Division, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Madam Hicks provides strategic direction for the UN Human Rights Office work across a broad range of pressing global human rights issues. She previously served as a Global Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch and as a Director of the Office of Returns and Communities in the UN Mission in Kosovo, as well as Deputy High Representative for Human Rights in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Her experience and insight bring great value to our discussion today. Finally, our guest of honor, His Excellency Professor Robert Dorsey, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Cooperation, African Integration, and Togolese abroad of the Republic of Togo. Beyond his distinguished diplomatic career, Professor Dorsey is also a full professor of political philosophy, a passionate defender of Africa's dignity, values, and development. On the issue of reparation, he has worked tirelessly to secure recognition of the wrongs of slavery and colonialism, including the African Union's designation of these as crimes against humanity and genocide, and the proclamation of the Decade of the African Diaspora and Black Roots. I think before we proceed to the next segment, I should end here back to, because also there is a photo session, right?
No, afterwards.
No, afterwards. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, these 5 distinguished speakers embody Africa's and the Caribbean's continuing quests for truth, justice, and transformation. Their collective voices from diplomacy, government, and human rights advocacy offer both moral authority and practical guidance for our work. We shall now proceed to their statement, beginning with His Excellency, Mr. Nkosi, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of South Africa. But before Ambassador Nkosi takes the floor, I should ask for your permission that I need to leave and attend equally another important event. So, Your Excellency, Ambassador Nkosi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my dear brother and colleague, Ambassador Osi, for a very warm welcome and introduction. Much appreciated. Allow me to join the moderator in extending a very hearty, warm welcome to our guest of honor, His Excellency Professor Robert Dusi, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Cooperation, African Integration, and Togolese abroad. Mr. Minister, we are very much happy to have you here. And indeed, your presence here attests to the Togolese leadership on this important project of restoring the dignity of African people and people of African descent. And it has been a great honor and a pleasure to work with your envoy here, my dear brother Yakole, to put together, to conceptualize this event. And indeed, I'm glad that it has now come to fruition and we're here, we're meeting. So, Minister, you're welcome. And I also take the opportunity to welcome all the excellencies around the table. I welcome distinguished delegates and, of course, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to deliver remarks on this important occasion of this high-level event that seeks to explore ways to consolidate the normative framework in the quest for justice for the victims of slavery, deportation, and colonization. This gathering is framed within the second international decade for people of African descent, as proclaimed by the United Nations last December under the theme, People of African Descent, Consideration, Justice, and Development. Indeed, it is time to explore all avenues, including law and justice mechanisms within the United Nations system as a pathway and concrete action towards restorative justice. Similarly, we welcome the contextualization of this event within the African Union theme for this year, namely, Justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. We maintain that this theme remains our strategic rallying point for the realization of reparatory justice and commend the African Union leadership for extending it to a decade. We consider this event as an expression of solidarity within the Africans and people of African descent in their ongoing struggle against the menace of racism and racial discrimination. It should be seen as a recognition of the sacrifices Africans and people of African descent made, as well as their efforts in raising international public awareness about these inhuman tragedies. We must never relent in our efforts to fight racism, racial discrimination, hate speech, targeted violence, xenophobia, and other related intolerance that continue to afflict scores of people and communities around the world, particularly Africans and people of African descent. We share the view that the enduring impact of historic injustices on Africans and people of African descent is evident in continued disparity, amongst others, in access to education and healthcare, high levels of youth unemployment, intergenerational poverty, and the denial of the full enjoyment of their human rights. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we embark on this journey of seeking reparations, we must consistently remember and reaffirm that the Durban Declaration and Program of Action of 2001, a historic milestone in efforts to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other related intolerance, and almost 25 years since its adoption, remains the most appropriate and relevant international framework for guiding our fight against the scourge of racism. Accordingly, its full and effective implementation as a vehicle to mobilize the international community in the efforts to combat racism is imperative. The DDPA took the first step towards reparatory justice for Africans and people of African descent by recognizing that slavery, slave trade, and transatlantic slave trade were crimes against humanity. Accordingly, all our efforts should be predicated on this international framework as we approach the 25th anniversary since its adoption. The international community must act with much greater vigor to migrate from rhetoric to reality towards serious and concrete action against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance through practical and meaningful steps. Indeed, the Accra Proclamation on Reparations affirms that the fulfillment of reparations is a moral as well as a legal imperative rooted in the principles of justice, human rights, and human dignity, and that the claim for reparations represents a concrete step towards remedying historical wrongs and fostering healing among people of African descent, as well as Africans in general. In this regard, we should continue to call on states to support the initiatives of the African Union relating to reparatory justice for Africans and people of African descent, with a view to identifying and fulfilling their responsibilities concerning reparations for slavery and colonialism in Africa and throughout the African diaspora. In addition, we should continue to utilize all platforms available to urge states that have not taken measures on reparations to initiate a comprehensive approach to address and repair the legacies of the past through a multiplicity of measures, including through formal apologies, truth-telling processes, and reparations in various forms. In this regard, the importance of political will to effectively deliver reparations justice that is multi-pronged, context-specific, intersectional, and grounded in international human rights cannot be overemphasized. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to successfully combat racism and its contemporary manifestations, we must deepen international cooperation and ensure adequate funding at national, regional, and international levels to effectively protect human rights, the human rights of those who continue to suffer at the hands of the perpetrators of racist and discriminatory crimes. In this connection, we must collectively support the work of the ad hoc committee for the elaboration of complementary standards of the ICERT that seeks to provide new normative standards aimed at combating all forms of contemporary racism, including incitement to racial and religious hatred. Finally, it is indeed only through these actions at international level that we stand a chance of not only pushing back against the resurgence of racism, racial discrimination, and other contemporary manifestations, but indeed of restoring the dignity of African and people of African descent. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nkosi. And at this point, I think I will act as a moderator and also as a speaker. So I will take the floor now. Excellency Professor Robert Dossi, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration, and Togolese abroad. Excellencies, ambassadors, and permanent representatives, esteemed participants from Africa, the Caribbean, and wider global African community, our friends from civil society organizations, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to join you this morning. As one of the co-organizers and sponsors of this important high-level event, allow me to begin with a few words of commendation. Firstly, let me recognize and acknowledge the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration, and Togolese abroad, Professor Robert Dossi, for his leadership and active involvement in convening this event. His presence here underlines an enduring commitment to Africa's renaissance Pan-Africanism, peace, and justice. Secondly, I commend all participants for your attendance. It is encouraging to see that many key stakeholders are represented here. I am hopeful that your participation would be translated into active support to enable us advance ideas and initiatives to confront and dismantle structures and systems that continue to frustrate the quest for reparations. Excellencies, reparative justice should be the overarching objective to address the lasting legacies of slavery, colonialism, and systemic discrimination, which continue to reinforce socio-economic disparities for people of African descent. During this time of profound global development, we need leadership and partnerships within Africa and the diaspora to mobilize support, to drive advocacy, and to shape policy that will help address the historical injustices that Africans and people of African descent have suffered. And this includes advancing the global call for reparations. It is in this context that Ghana welcomes the theme selected for this timely event, which is consolidating the normative framework in the struggle for justice for the victims of slavery, deportation, and colonization, contribution of international law and UN mechanisms for urgent, just, and lasting reparations. For us, the theme could not have been more appropriate. Reparations are necessary to correct the historical wrongs and are needed now to help remedy the deep-rooted inequalities that still shape our world today. We, however, understand the ongoing debate, differing opinions, and sometimes the confusion about whether this is the right time to push for reparations or whether it is politically feasible or even legally justified. From Ghana's perspective, there can be no better time than now for the global community to engage in meaningful, truthful, and respectful conversations about reparations. This year in particular marks a unique and defining moment in our collective quest for reparations. Within and beyond Africa, we are witnessing effective mobilization of political actors, citizens, civil society, and members of the diaspora. The declaration by the African Union of the year 2025 and the ensuing decade as a period to demand justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations is a major step forward. Furthermore, the successful hosting of the second Africa CARICOM Summit on 7 September 2025 in Addis Ababa, where leaders from both continents unanimously adopted the Declaration on Transcontinental Partnership in Pursuit of Reparatory Justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, has added legitimacy to the growing awareness and demand. The declaration from the summit reaffirms that the struggle for reparatory justice is not confined to one region and no longer a silent struggle. Indeed, reparations have truly assumed the character of a global movement binding Africa, the Caribbean, and other regions in solidarity and shared destiny. In my own country, Ghana, reparative justice has assumed national significance, driven by a moral, historical, and developmental imperative. Our president, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, who doubles as the African Union champion for reparations, is leading the charge with strong leadership and creativity in support of this endeavor. the president has publicly stated that Africa's call for reparative justice is no longer a whisper. It is a unified demand grounded in historical truth, moral clarity, and our unwavering commitment to dignity. To demonstrate his strategic approach and give further impetus to the demand for reparations, he, for the first time in Ghana's history, has appointed a special envoy for reparations in the person of Ambassador Eko Spiogabra, a distinguished Ghanaian statesman. As a special envoy for reparations, Ambassador Spiogabra is expected to coordinate with African governments, the African Union, the CARICOM, and global advocacy groups to advance Africa's case for reparations. This current positive momentum reminds us of how far we have come and what more remains to be done. Excellencies, our event today fits into this broad effort. The discussions today should therefore help to consolidate the substantial amount of work that has been undertaken to drive progress at the national, regional, and the global arena on the issues of reparations. I am therefore confident that in the panel discussions that would immediately follow this opening segment, attention would be focused on addressing some of the core challenges hindering Africa's access to reparations. It is equally my hope that we could stimulate discussions on strategic approaches to advance reparations, including how the diplomatic community and the African diaspora here in Switzerland could be mobilized to support this important global project. We should also look at ways of using the Human Rights Council to come up with a mandate or mechanism to pursue the goal of reparations. The recent 60th session of the Human Rights Council adopted an important resolution titled "From Rhetoric to Reality," a global call for concrete action against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, led by the African Group. This important resolution specifically called for measures to remedy historical wrongs, including paying reparations. I would also like to make mention of the joint statement on reparations, which were spearheaded by a cross-regional group of states, once again led by the African Group. We must seek to build upon these gains. Once again, Excellencies, as the global community comes together this year to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and the 60th anniversary of the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we have the unique opportunity to use these important commemorative events as watershed period for deep reflections and action in support of the demand for reparations. In fact, as we all know, the DDPA acknowledges the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity and affirms the need for reparations. Furthermore, significant events such as the Africa Diaspora Summit on Reparations held in 2022 and the Accra Reparations Conference of 2023, which were held under the auspices of the African Union, affirm that reparations are a legal and moral imperative grounded in justice, dignity, and human rights. It is obvious that for reparatory justice to succeed, Africa must adopt a smart, unified, and value-driven strategy that reframes reparations not just as a historical obligation, but as a vehicle for structural transformation and collective healing. Specifically, reparations must be understood not only as restitution for past crimes, but also as a call to correct the systemic imbalances that persist today as reflected in the unjust economic global system. In concluding, I would say that we are at a critical juncture of history for restorative and reparative justice, and it is a moment that we must seize together. Ghana is committed to supporting the growing Pan-African solidarity as a strategic step towards ensuring that reparations remain at the front and center of the global movement for justice. We are ready to support interregional and intergenerational knowledge and best practice exchanges on building popular support for reparations, including building human rights considerations into achieving it. We are convinced that a robust institutional framework grounded in international law and human rights principles are required to make this a reality. I thank you for your kind attention. At this juncture, I will call on my sister, Ambassador Anne-Catherine Lasek, to make her remarks. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Excellences, distingués délégués, Mesdames et Messieurs, il y a 221 ans, sur une terre embrasée d'espoir et de souffrance, Haïti s'est levée. En 1804, après 13 années de lutte et de sacrifice, un peuple d'esclaves brisa ses chaînes pour proclamer au monde un message éternel. Nul être humain n'est né pour être la propriété d'un autre. Dans cette insurrection naquit la première république noire indépendante, porteuse d'un idéal universel, celui de la liberté, de la dignité et de la justice. Ce combat pour l'humanité tout entière n'est pas isolé. En 1791, les tambours de bois caïman avaient déjà retenti comme un appel sacré à la liberté. En 1848, la voix de Victor Schulcher en France proclamait l'abolition de l'esclavage. Et en 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. rêvait à Washington d'un monde où les fils d'anciens esclaves et les fils d'anciens maîtres pourront s'asseoir ensemble à la table de la fraternité. Et encore aujourd'hui, ce rêve reste inachevé. Nous sommes réunis ici, au cœur de la deuxième décennie internationale des personnes d'ascendance africaine, sous le triple appel à la reconnaissance, la justice et le développement. Nous sommes ici pour transformer la mémoire en un mouvement et la douleur en un devoir. La justice réparatrice n'est pas une vengeance du passé, c'est une promesse pour l'avenir. Elle reconnaît que l'esclavage, la déportation et la colonisation furent des crimes contre l'humanité, mais elle nous appelle aussi à réparer ces crimes qui ont brisé les vies, les cultures, les terres et les mémoires. C'est un honneur pour moi de m'adresser à vous aujourd'hui au nom du groupe des États de la CARICOM à Genève à l'occasion de cet événement historique consacré au renforcement du cadre normatif international pour la justice et les réparations des victimes de l'esclavage, de la déportation et de la colonisation. Je tiens à saluer l'initiative conjointe du Ghana, de l'Afrique du Sud et du Togo en partenariat avec l'Union africaine, la CARICOM et le Haut-Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme. Cette collaboration incarne une vision partagée, celle d'une Afrique et d'une diaspora unies dans la quête de justice historique, morale et juridique. Elle nous rappelle que même si les océans nous séparent, notre mémoire et notre combat sont un. Haïti, qui fut la première à ouvrir la voie, croit que l'histoire appelle aujourd'hui à une nouvelle alliance morale et juridique entre l'Afrique, la Caraïbe et les Nations Unies. Nous saluons la proclamation d'Accra sur les réparations, les décisions historiques de l'Union africaine, qualifiant ces actes de crime, ainsi que la détermination de la CARICOM à bâtir un front commun pour la justice réparatrice. Car aucune réparation durable ne pourra se construire sans solidarité mondiale entre les descendants de ceux et celles qui ont souffert et les héritiers de ceux et celles qui ont profité. Mais cette solidarité doit désormais se traduire dans le droit. L'adoption d'une résolution du Conseil des droits de l'homme définissant les obligations des États en matière de réparation pour l'esclavage et la colonisation, l'élaboration d'une résolution spécifique de l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies sur la justice réparatrice, reconnaissant le droit des peuples à la réparation et au développement. Les recours aux voies consultatives et contentieuses internationales pour établir la responsabilité juridique et morale de ces crimes historiques. Et enfin, le renforcement de la mise en œuvre de la déclaration et du programme d'action de Durban afin qu'ils deviennent non pas un texte oublié, mais un instrument vivant de transformation. Le moment est venu pour que les paroles cèdent la place à l'action par la création d'un mécanisme de coopération Afrique-Caraïbes destiné à identifier et soutenir les projets de réparation symbolique, éducative, économique et culturelle, par la mise en place d'un fonds pour la mémoire et la résilience financé conjointement par les États et le secteur privé, consacré à la reconstruction des patrimoines africains et afro-descendants, et par la formation d'une plateforme académique et juridique internationale chargée de consolider la recherche, la documentation et la jurisprudence sur la justice réparatrice. Excellence, l'histoire nous observe. Elle nous demande que ferons-nous de l'héritage de ceux et celles qui ont combattu avant nous. Nous ne pouvons pas changer le passé, mais nous pouvons choisir ce qu'il deviendra dans l'avenir. Car, pour reprendre les mots du poète Aimé Césaire, il n'y a pas de dignité à vivre à genoux devant l'histoire. Ensemble, redressons cette histoire, donnons un sens au mot réparation, non pas comme un simple retour en arrière, mais comme une renaissance partagée. Et que nos voix unies dans la mémoire et la justice fassent entendre ce message au monde. Le temps est venu de réparer afin que nous puissions enfin nous réconcilier. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Ambassador Catherine. Excellencies, we will now hear from Madam Peggy Hicks, the Director, Thematic Activities and Special Procedures, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Madam Hicks, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm truly honored to be part of this august and essential gathering and to speak on behalf of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, who of course would have been very glad to be with you today. The impact of colonialism, enslavement, and the trade in enslaved Africans is not, as we all know, confined to the past. Its consequences stretch into the present, perpetuating systemic racism against Africans and people of African descent. As recognized in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, people of African descent continue to suffer the enduring consequences of slavery, the slave trade, and colonialism. Yet despite some initiatives, no state has fully addressed these legacies or the ongoing impact of systemic racism. This raises the question, as Ambassador Nkosi put on the table, how do we move from rhetoric to reality? What type of initiative will allow us to coalesce all the actions that are underway already, to amplify them, and to allow them to become an avalanche of action that really moves this agenda forward? And to me, that is the mission of gatherings like this one today. Earlier this month, at the 60th session of the Human Rights Council, The High Commissioner presented his report on racial justice and equality for Africans and people of African descent, and it specifically called for reparatory justice for legacies of enslavement, the trade in enslaved Africans, and colonialism. The report underscores the reparatory justice is key to dismantling systemic racism and transforming the present and the future of Africans and people of African descent. Addressing these legacies requires, as the report shows, a comprehensive approach firmly grounded in human rights. That entails the implementation of a range of measures, including formal apologies, truth-telling processes, and educational initiatives. It encompasses the restitution of human remains and cultural heritage, the provision of compensation, and the access to medical and psychosocial support. The report also provides examples from various countries and regions demonstrating how taking these measures contributes to justice, healing, and the reaffirmation of human dignity. First and foremost, as we know, it is states that are responsible for taking these measures. Other stakeholders, though, such as academic institutions, religious groups, and businesses, should also confront their own pasts and explore concrete avenues for reparations on their own behalf. Crucially, reparatory justice demands genuine and continuous consultation with and the participation of affected communities. There is no one-size-fits-all formula. Initiatives and processes must be grounded in historical realities and local contexts and address communities' evolving priorities. Applying an intersectional approach and centering the distinct experiences and voices of women of African descent is also key. Civil society, notably organizations, have played a vital role in encouraging states, the United Nations, and others to take bolder steps. These civil society-led processes have often filled the gap where governments have failed to act. They should be fully supported as part of broader efforts to strengthen solidarity across equality and human rights movements, as well as among states and regions. Broader reforms are also needed to correct the historical exclusion of Africans and people of African descent. Earlier this month at the Human Rights Council, High Commissioner Turk called for stronger African representation on the United Nations Security Council, noting that many nations were still under colonial rule when the system was established. Reforming development aid and financial systems would also contribute to easing crushing debt, enabling African economies to invest in education, health, and other critical priorities. Africans and people of African descent across the world today have long advocated for reparatory justice. Today, cross-national initiatives are increasingly advancing these calls for accountability and redress on the global stage. And we have heard, of course, from the Ambassador of Ghana, how the recent gathering in 2023 of the African Union and the Caribbean Community Reparations Commission have played an important role in sustaining some of this momentum with a 10-part plan for reparatory justice and resolutions by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the 2023 Accra Proclamation on Reparations, as well as the decision by the African Union that emphasized the gravity of historical injustices perpetrated against Africans and people of African descent through slavery, deportation, apartheid, and colonialization. Of course, another notable initiative, as we have heard, the African Union's theme of the year, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations, which has been extended into a decade covering the period from 2026 to 2036. The second AU-UN high-level dialogue on human rights in May this year underscored the significance of joint efforts to promote this theme, including in the context of the AU-UN Joint Framework for Human Rights. And as we've heard here in Geneva, a historic step was also taken at the 60th session of the Human Rights Council, where the resolution previously mentioned on Rhetoric to Reality, a global call for concrete action against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, was adopted without a vote. That significant milestone illustrates the capacity of the international community to come together across regions and demonstrate a shared commitment to fight against racism. So how do we achieve that avalanche of action? As the Ambassador of Ghana also said, and I was inspired by his commitment to saying, this is the right time. There can be no better time. This effort, as he noted, is grounded in history, but it's about the future. And that is a message I think that will resonate with people as well, that it can be a vehicle, as Ambassador Entwe said, for transformation and healing, that it can correct systemic imbalances. So while we have to look back, we also have to look forward and engage youth and others who will see that promise of a better future. That will allow us, as Ambassador Lassague said, to move from memory into movement, to inspire all those who need to act to create the avalanche of action that we are seeking. As we prepare for the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action next year, I want to affirm as strongly as I can that you can count on the steadfast support of the UN Human Rights Office in our efforts to join with you to end systemic racism and deliver reparatory justice for legacies of enslavement and the trade in enslaved Africans and colonialism. We will continue to prioritize and play as effective a role as we possibly can in this important initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Hicks. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is now my singular honor to invite our guest of honor, His Excellency Professor Robert Dussey, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Cooperation, African Integration, and Togolese abroad, to give us our keynote address for this morning. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Atui. Excellence, Monsieur le ministre délégué, Ministre Yakole Johnson, Excellencies, Ambassador Kosi, Madame Catherine Lazen, dear Madame Peggy Hicks, Excellencies, Ambassadors, Permanent Representative and Head of Diplomatic Mission accredited to the United Nations here in Geneva, dear guests, panelists, students, and also I thank the participants online. First and foremost, I would like to thank you for your remarkable presence at this high-level event, which reflects your interest in the cause of the people of Africa and demonstrates your commitment to continuing the fight for the legitimate interest for our continent, including, of course, those who are most marginalized. Ladies and gentlemen, fighting this fight for Africa, especially in these troubled times, marked by complex challenges, require, as you know, boldness and creativity. The current issue compel us indeed to be vigilant. To be vigilant because more than ever, and not to shy away from adversity or disdainful silence. There also urge us to reinvent ourselves in a more proactive and decisive role in the common quest for listening, justice and respect. Our struggle is for Africa. Our struggle is for Africa is not, I would like to be frank and sincere with everyone. Our struggle is not against anyone. We have to be clear. We are not against anyone. Our struggle is for ourselves and also for humanity. We are not against anyone, so be sure we are not coming here with gun. We come here to discuss, to open dialogue, and discuss about our history, to discuss also about what our future together and what we can do together for peace in humanity. It's clear for us, the history of our colonization is one of the difficult history what we have in the world. But we have the responsibility to find a way for the people, for the new generation here in this room or right now in the world. Mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, comme vous le saviez, l'ordre mondial établi au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale a gardé hors de ses murailles protectrices des siècles d'injustices subies par les peuples d'Afrique. Nous n'allons pas revenir sur toutes ces souffrances, mais nous pensons que, comme vous venez de le dire, vous tous et toutes ici, l'heure est venue pour qu'on puisse en parler, pas en parler dans la guerre, mais en parler parce que c'est notre dignité de vous dire la vérité. C'est notre dignité de partager la vérité avec vous. Nous ne pouvons pas le faire. Nous le faisons assez souvent dans tous les forats, mais il est important de venir ici, pas aux Nations Unies, dans une des agences des Nations Unies, parce que nous l'avions déjà dit à la dernière Assemblée générale des Nations Unies à New York. Nous pensons qu'ici, il faudrait aussi le réitérer, surtout à vous qui représentez la Commission des droits de l'homme des Nations Unies. Mesdames et messieurs, comme je le disais, le Togo, aux côtés des autres pays frères, a voulu prendre l'initiative de travailler sur cette question afin de pousser l'agenda de l'Union africaine. Et c'est pourquoi, vous l'aviez bien souligné, sous le leadership du président du Conseil, le président Faure Gnassingbé, le Togo a introduit une décision importante. Et vous le saviez, vous l'avez souligné, cette décision qui avait été prise le 16 février de cette année à Addis Abeba, en qualifiant les crimes de l'esclavage, de la colonisation, de la déportation, comme des crimes contre l'humanité. Mais j'ai l'impression que vous aviez peur. That crimes is a crimes against humanity and also genocide against the African people. You have to say that crime is the genocide. It's not only crimes against humanity, it's genocide also. Because we can say genocide for another people in the world, why we cannot say genocide for the African people? Ces crimes sont un génocide contre les peuples d'Afrique. Et c'est la vérité de l'histoire. Personne ne peut effacer cette vérité. La décision de la conférence des chefs d'État de l'Union africaine du 16 février 2025 a bel et bien qualifié ces crimes de génocide contre les peuples d'Afrique. Et je dis et je vous redis, en toute sincérité, la main sur le cœur. Vous voulez que je mette la main sur le cœur? I think mon cœur est à gauche. La main sur le cœur, que ce n'est contre personne. Cette lutte est une lutte pour nous tous. Donc, jamais n'interprétez pas cette lutte des peuples d'Afrique comme une lutte contre une nation, contre un peuple. Mais c'est la reconnaissance de notre histoire. Et cette histoire, we have to share it together because it's our history. C'est notre sens de responsabilité. Mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, chers ambassadeurs, ces injustices du passé nous donnent l'occasion, une fois de plus, de travailler ensemble afin que cette lutte que nous menons puisse aboutir, comme nous l'avions déjà fait, à l'Union africaine, puisse aboutir à une reconnaissance, à une résolution des Nations Unies. Le but de partager avec vous cette préoccupation ici, dans cette salle, c'est parce que nous voulons qu'un jour, une résolution, et nous allons le faire avec votre soutien. Le Togo et tous les pays africains le feront avec votre soutien afin qu'une résolution soit prise à l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies qualifiant les crimes de l'esclavage, de la déportation, de la colonisation comme des crimes contre l'humanité et des génocides contre les peuples d'Afrique. C'est l'étape, je pense, normative pour laquelle nous sommes ici. Mais nous ne sommes pas des experts, nous allons laisser les experts, je vois le professeur Delidi et tous les professeurs, les grands experts là, nous aider pour la matérialisation de cette résolution dans le cadre des Nations Unies. Mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, nous voulons ici être brefs et conclure pour vous dire que c'est avec toute légitimité que nous pensons que nous devons travailler pour cette cause. Et comme nous l'avions dit, cette cause, elle n'est pas uniquement pour nous, mais elle est pour tout le monde. Dear friends, dear brothers and sisters, that is the reason why I call on for the mobilization of all and for the heightened sense of responsibility of our common institution to urgently initiate a draft resolution that would enable us to move away from the Africanization of the cause of reparation toward a global, inclusive, and concerted process of justice and reparation for the people of Africa through law. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Excellency, Professor Dose. And at this juncture, I think we have come to the end of the opening session or opening ceremony for today's program. We will now, since we are a little behind time, we will now break for just 5 minutes for a family photo, after which we will reconvene for the discussion segment, which will be moderated by Professor Dekila. So I thank you very much. We take a short break now. Thank you.
And he said, we now enjoy a little outside, just outside the room. Everybody. You are invited for the group photo. Please, let's go outside, just outside the room for the group photo.
La réunion en salle du Conseil exécutif va reprendre. The meeting in the executive boardroom is about to start.
Ladies and gentlemen, please have a seat.
La réunion en salle du Conseil exécutif va reprendre. The meeting in the executive boardroom is about to start.
En ligne, c'est OK.
Mesdames et messieurs, je pense que nous allons reprendre. Please have a seat. We will resume. Excellence. We are now resuming with the discussion and start the discussion in the panels. We will start with the first panel, which will be moderated by Professor Delegi Eric Dejila, Professor of Practice of International Relations, Special Advisor of Director of Geneva, African Strategy of the Geneva Institute here in Switzerland. We have 3 panelists, Mr. Abdulaziz Thioy, Deputy Director of Global Operation Division of the United Nations High Commissioner, Madame Catherine Manakula, member of the Working Group of People of African Descent, and Professor Fouad Zabiev, Professor of International Law, Co-Director of an LLM in International Law, Geneva Institute graduate. Professor Dejila, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Excellency, Professor Robert Ducé, my dear brother, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Togo, Excellency, Minister Johnson, my dear brother, Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to take the floor for this important conversation. And I'm particularly delighted to be here to discuss a critical issue related to reparatory justice for victims of slavery, deportation, and colonization. What role and contributions of international law and the United Nations? Last month, the American Journal of International Law issued an unbound on what can international law repair. I encourage you to look at this very critical publication. In this collection, authors underline how reparation goes beyond a technical legal exercise, as it represents a profound political project. They ask whether international law, which has been long implicated in colonial domination and racial hierarchy, can now serve as a lever and vehicle to repair. In this collection, my colleagues, some of them stated that reparation is political because it challenged the legitimacy and legacy of international law itself. Obviously, reparation is plural, and its modus operandi can take several paths. An important trend that I identify is that reparation must move beyond financial compensation toward transformation of power, memory, and institutional authority. Mesdames et messieurs, le débat juridique sur la réparation est complexe et sensible. Mon collègue sud-africain Christopher Gervers de l'Université de Wits en Afrique du Sud a par exemple avancé la thèse un peu provocative selon laquelle la réparation a servi de levier pour maintenir la suprématie blanche. Vous pouvez lire ces travaux parus le mois dernier dans la revue de droit international American Journal of International Law. D'autres juristes tels que Alan Cohen questionne le rôle du droit international en tant que levier ou au contraire obstacle de la réparation. Vous voyez donc que le sujet est complexe lorsque, en plus, il est connecté à un fait historique, celui de la colonisation, qui a touché tout particulièrement le peuple africain. Alors, pour discuter plus avant de ces questions, dans le premier panel que j'ai l'honneur de modérer, il me fait plaisir d'accueillir en ligne, nous avons deux panélistes qui sont en ligne, Monsieur Abdoulaziz Thioye, cela a été mentionné, qui est directeur adjoint à la division des opérations mondiales au commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme. Deux mots sur ce premier panéliste à qui je donnerai tantôt la parole. Monsieur Thioye est un expert senior en droits de l'homme. Il a occupé à plusieurs reprises des postes de responsabilité au sein du Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, également bien dans les équipes mondiales à Genève. Et il a été directeur adjoint à la division mondiale des opérations, chef par intérim au service de l'État. C'est un grand plaisir de l'accueillir dans ce panel pour partager la perspective des Nations Unies. Monsieur Thioye, est-ce que vous êtes connecté avec nous et puis-je vous donner la parole?
S'il vous plaît, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, on vous entend.
D'accord. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le modérateur. Dear Excellencies, distinguished guests, participants, students, and so on, those in the room, and ceux qui sont en ligne. Je voudrais d'abord m'excuser de ne pas être physiquement dans la salle, bien qu'étant en Genève. Là, j'étais en route, la nature en a décidé autrement. Donc, la tempête qui s'est déclenchée en a décidé autrement. Peut-être qui sait, peut-être que c'est un signe. J'espère que c'est un signe positif qui permettra qui va rejaillir sur la qualité de nos travaux. Je voudrais rebondir sur ce que vous avez dit en disant que c'est un sujet d'une extrême complexité. Et je voudrais, à l'entame, dire ceci, commencer par dire que depuis 2021, le haut-commissaire aux droits de l'homme plaide en faveur de la justice réparatrice dans le cadre de son agenda pour un changement transformateur en faveur de la justice raciale et de l'égalité pour les Africains et les personnes d'ascendance africaine. Le secrétaire général également et les mécanismes des Nations Unies de lutte contre le racisme ont également défini les étapes nécessaires pour parvenir à une justice réparatrice. Je peux citer le rapport spécial sur les formes contemporaines de racisme, le Forum permanent pour les personnes d'ascendance africaine et le groupe de travail sur les personnes également sur les personnes d'ascendance africaine. Je pourrais ne pas mentionner le travail en cours par le Comité pour l'élimination de la discrimination raciale, qui est en train d'élaborer une nouvelle recommandation générale sur les réparations liées aux injustices historiques de l'esclavage des Africains et aux préjudices et crimes qui en ont découlé. Nous avons dans ce panel, nous avons Dr Guissé, qui est membre du comité pour l'élimination de la discrimination raciale, mais également Madame Dr Namakula, qui est connectée online et qui va donner la perspective du groupe de travail d'experts sur les personnes d'ascendance africaine. Alors, en ce qui concerne le Haut-Commissariat plus précisément, dans son rapport soumis en juillet au Conseil des droits de l'homme sur la justice réparatrice, le Haut-Commissaire a souligné les positions divergentes des États quant à l'existence d'une obligation de réparation pour l'esclavage et ou la colonisation. Le rapport reconnaît l'existence de ces débats. Certains contestent la responsabilité et la réparation des héritages historiques, invoquant la complexité de traiter des violations graves des droits humains survenues il y a plusieurs siècles, avec des auteurs et des victimes qui sont décédés aujourd'hui, et l'affirmation que les préjudices liés au racisme systémique ont pris fin avec l'abolition de l'esclavage. D'autres invoquent le principe de l'intertemporalité, selon lequel les règles de droit pénal en vigueur au moment des faits peuvent être appliquées pour exclure les poursuites pour des actes antérieurs. D'autres soulignent également la difficulté de définir la responsabilité des États, ainsi que la conception et le financement des programmes de réparation efficaces, notamment en ce qui concerne l'étendue temporelle et matérielle et les bénéficiaires potentiels, soulevant des questions complexes, notamment sur les compensations financières. Évidemment, les réparations ne peuvent pas uniquement se résumer à des compensations financières. Ça, on est d'accord là-dessus. Cependant, dans certains contextes, les victimes et les auteurs sont encore en vie, et ce qui impose à l'État un devoir de rendre des comptes. De plus, les revendications ne s'éteignent pas avec la disparition des victimes directes. Si elles ne sont pas traitées, les revendications, elles risquent d'aggraver les discriminations systémiques. Donc, le caractère contenu de certains actes et crimes, ainsi que les exceptions au délai de prescription pour les violations graves des droits humains, constituent des crimes internationaux qui peuvent offrir des voies juridiques pour surmonter ces obstacles. Certains, notamment au cours des consultations que le Bureau a organisées, je vais dire le Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, depuis quelques années, nous organisons beaucoup de consultations avec des chercheurs, des spécialistes du droit international, des doctrinaires en général, qui ont remis en question la légitimité des lois conçues par et pour les puissances coloniales pour réparer les structures qu'elles ont elles-mêmes soutenues. Ils appellent à une décolonisation du droit international et de ces doctrines afin de réaliser les principes fondamentaux d'égalité, de non-discrimination et de dignité humaine à travers la justice réparatrice. Donc, nous voyons bien qu'il existe que des discussions supplémentaires entre acteurs clés soient nécessaires, notamment sur le principe de l'intertemporalité, certains ont affirmé lors de ces consultations-là que c'est la pertinence même du droit international pour répondre aux grands enjeux de l'humanité qui est en jeu. D'autres estiment que le formalisme juridique empêche le droit international d'exploiter pleinement son potentiel pour soutenir les réparations liées à la colonisation, à l'esclavage et, par exemple, en considérant le racisme systémique comme une violation continue du droit international. Donc, ce qu'il faut retenir par rapport à cela, c'est que là où il existe une volonté politique de mobiliser le droit pour répondre aux conséquences transgénérationnelles de l'esclavage, sous la forme de racisme contemporain, il existe aussi des moyens d'y parvenir. Donc, qui veut, peut. Comme le souligne le rapport, les obstacles juridiques, dans la mesure où ils existent, ne doivent pas être considérés comme insurmontables. Alors, en ce qui concerne le rôle des mécanismes des Nations Unies, je dois ici souligner, rappeler aussi que nous avons achevé la première année de la deuxième décennie internationale pour les personnes d'ascendance africaine. Il ne fait aucun doute que cette décennie constitue une opportunité pour intensifier les efforts et prendre des mesures plus décisives afin de remédier aux injustices historiques et à leurs manifestations contemporaines. La justice réparatrice est en effet essentielle à la réalisation des piliers de reconnaissance. Il y a 3 piliers, la reconnaissance, la justice et le développement. Le programme d'activité, pour ceux qui ne sont pas familiers avec le programme de la décennie, énonce plusieurs objectifs directement liés à la justice réparatrice. À titre d'exemple, il vise sous le pilier reconnaissance à garantir que les manuels scolaires et autres supports éducatifs reflètent les faits historiques, notamment en ce qui concerne l'esclavage, la traite négrière, la traite transatlantique et la colonisation. Il invite également les États, dans le cadre du pilier de la justice, à reconnaître et à exprimer un profond regret pour les souffrances et atrocités infligées à des millions d'hommes, de femmes et d'enfants du fait de l'esclavage, de la traite négrière, de la colonisation, de l'apartheid, du génocide et d'autres tragédies passées. Nous avons vu quelques États prendre action par rapport à ces piliers. Je peux citer l'Allemagne et je peux citer également d'autres pays qui ont exprimé, demandé pardon et un profond regret pour les souffrances et autres atrocités infligées à des millions d'hommes. Il convient de rappeler que la mise en œuvre du programme d'activité de la décennie internationale fait partie intégrante de la mise en œuvre pleine et effective de la déclaration et programme d'action de Durban. Et c'est ce qui, dans le cadre de la Convention internationale sur l'élimination de toutes les formes de discrimination raciale. Le secrétaire général, le haut-commissaire et les mécanismes ont à cœur de continuer à relayer les appels à la justice réparatrice et de promouvoir une approche fondée sur le droit international des droits de l'homme. Et cela se fait à travers différents forums à New York, à Genève, et également, par exemple, lors des séries de dialogues sur l'Afrique, ainsi que dans les débats au sein de l'Union africaine. Le groupe de travail d'experts sur les personnes d'ascendance africaine, le forum permanent et le rapporteur spécial sur le racisme ont formulé des recommandations sur la justice réparatrice dans le rapport au Conseil des droits de l'homme. Le comité pour l'élimination de la discrimination raciale prépare également une recommandation générale sur ce thème. Et ces contributions précieuses nourrissent les débats mondiaux tout en les ancrant dans le droit international des droits de l'homme. Le Haut-Commissariat a également renforcé le mouvement international, comme vous le savez, pour la justice réparatrice, en créant des espaces d'écoute active et de dialogue avec les Africains et les personnes d'ascendance africaine, en veillant à ce que son travail reflète les expériences vécues ainsi que les savoirs et les expertises. En préparation du dernier rapport que j'ai cité, qui a été soumis à l'attention du Conseil, et examiné à la session, qui a été soumis en juillet et examiné à la session de septembre. Donc, le Haut-Commissariat a organisé des consultations avec des militants de la société civile, d'ascendance africaine, d'Amérique du Nord et des Caraïbes, certains que moi-même j'ai facilité, et puis d'Afrique en avril 2025. 9 consultations virtuelles ont également été tenues avec des militants de la société civile, principalement d'ascendance africaine, des Amériques, du Moyen-Orient et d'Afrique du Nord et d'Asie-Pacifique, d'Europe ainsi qu'avec des entreprises. L'élaboration en cours de la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur la promotion et le plein respect des droits humains des personnes d'ascendance africaine donne un nouvel élan aux États pour répondre aux appels croissants en faveur de la justice réparatrice. Je voudrais juste souligner que certains d'entre vous ont pris part à la dernière session sur le travail autour de la déclaration. Donc, j'encourage chacun à s'appuyer sur les travaux du Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme et des mécanismes onusiens en particulier, s'axer sur contre le racisme pour faire progresser la justice réparatrice. Pour terminer sur, je voudrais terminer en disant ceci, je voudrais souligner l'importance des initiatives prises par l'Union africaine et la CARICOM dans la promotion de la justice réparatrice. Il faut reconnaître qu'il y a un travail extrêmement important qui est mené depuis quelques années et le rapprochement entre la CARICOM est à saluer. Leur engagement et le plaidoyer sont essentiels pour maintenir les appels à la responsabilité et à la réparation au cœur de l'agenda mondial. Le partenariat entre les deux institutions, réaffirmé lors du deuxième sommet Afrique-CARICOM à Addis Abeba en septembre dernier, représente une alliance stratégique sud-sud pour faire avancer les réparations et répondre aux séquelles durables de l'esclavage et de la colonisation. Le haut-commissaire a appelé à ce que ces processus nationaux, il y en a dans beaucoup de pays, soient complétés par des initiatives de dialogue et de coopération interétatique et transfrontalière, notamment avec l'Union africaine et les communautés des anciennes colonies. Le 9e congrès panafricain, qui se tiendra au Togo en décembre 2025, offrira également un espace de haut niveau pour définir des voies concrètes vers des réparations et des cadres de justice réparatrice allant au-delà de la compensation. Nous saluons son accent sur la réforme multilatérale, la justice, les réparations et les réformes structurelles dans les domaines de la santé, de l'éducation et de la représentation mondiale. Le Haut-Commissariat est prêt à soutenir ces processus. Donc, vous pouvez compter sur notre soutien. Concernant spécifiquement la décision récente de l'Union africaine, notre point de départ reste la déclaration et le programme d'action de Durban, qui reconnaît que les Africains et les personnes d'ascendance africaine ont été victimes de l'esclavage, de la traite négrière et de la colonisation et continuent de subir leurs conséquences. Cette reconnaissance a été essentielle pour porter ces revendications sur la scène internationale. La déclaration de Durban reconnaît également que l'esclavage et la traite négrière sont des crimes contre l'humanité et auraient toujours dû être considérés comme tels à travers la traite transatlantique. Donc, nous prenons note de l'adoption par l'Union africaine en février dernier d'une décision sur la qualification de l'esclavage, de la déportation et de la colonisation comme crimes contre l'humanité et actes de génocide contre les peuples d'Afrique et de sa demande à la Commission du droit international de l'Union africaine, en collaboration avec les parties concernées, de mener une étude sur les implications de cette qualification. Donc, conformément à l'appel du haut-commissaire à une justice réparatrice, répondant aux demandes des communautés concernées, nous encourageons la Commission du droit international de l'Union africaine à mener des consultations larges et inclusives, en particulier avec les femmes et les jeunes, dans le cadre de cette étude. Nous attendons avec beaucoup d'intérêt les conclusions de cette étude, prévues pour février 2026, et continuerons à suivre ces développements avec une grande attention. Cher modérateur, je m'arrête là. Je pourrais revenir pour répondre aux questions et également formuler quelques recommandations. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Thioy, pour votre intervention. Je retiens, sans vous paraphraser, l'importance de décoloniser la question de la réparation. Je retiens également le travail constant du Haut-Commissariat des Nations Unies et l'importance de collaborer avec les instances régionales, l'Union africaine notamment. Nous aurons l'occasion de poursuivre l'échange tout à l'heure, mais permettez-moi tout de suite de donner la parole à Madame Catherine Namakula, qui est membre du groupe de travail sur les personnes d'ascendance africaine. Elle est maître de conférence à l'Université de l'État libre en Afrique du Sud et spécialisée dans les droits humains et la justice pénale. Elle est également conseillère juridique et responsable locale auprès de plusieurs organes et associations. Madame Catherine Namakula, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Prof. Greetings from Uganda, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I bring you greetings from the working group of experts from people of African descent that has been very much at the center of this dialogue, and also the gratitude to the organizers for enlisting us. I would speak to the contribution of the working group of experts on descent, which has already been alluded to by our superior, Mr. Choi, and the preceding, the panelists before him. Right. First, we think about the victimization of Africa as a continent and persons of African heritage worldwide. That should also be at the center of our conversations because it has not been properly conceptualized. When you talk about 4 centuries of the slave trade and enslavement, more than 8 decades of colonization, and the current subsisting neocolonial aggression and extortion characterized by exploitation and aspects that Mr. Choi has already alluded to, which also include the situation of migrant workers of African descent in the Middle East and Asia, the relegation of the continent that is quite evident even at the center of the discussions and ongoing practices of deporting many of the persons that may not even be Africans to the African continent, that is sending out a very strong message about what positioning the continent is at right now. When we are talking about non-tariff barriers, we are talking about the disproportionate sanctions that are leveled against countries that are majorly inhabited by people of African descent. That's how we actually visualize or see the actual continued victimization of Africa as a continent and people of African descent worldwide. Even the conversation we are talking about of reparation, the dismissal of reparatory justice when it comes to people of African descent is quite also a stark example of the regard by humanity, shameful regard by humanity of people of African descent. Victimization of others is accepted. We have recently had a straightforward resolution about reparation to Russia, well-deserved and celebrated. But when it comes to people of African descent, it looks like a declaration of war as a conversation. And we do not understand why the rest of the world would not want to really give it the credits that it deserves. We see the kind of shifting more to what also Mr. Choi has talked about, to regrets other than apologies, very conscious endeavors, regrets that do not actually and was the first time that the world came together and addressed directly the thorny question of reparation for enslavement that made, and then the outcome document did talk about slavery as a crime against humanity and did make a retrospective statement that it should have always been so. And that's where people of African descent began to organize, and within all the subsequent developments that have emerged, including the decade for people of African descent, and now its renewal, confer and make a very straightforward demand for justice through reparation. A group of experts on people of African descent, as a special procedure of the Human Rights Council, does have a mandate to study the human rights situation in the diaspora and people of African descent worldwide and make recommendations. So this conversation on reparation is evidence-based. It's based on consultations that have been made and done widely within the framework of the United Nations among persons around the world. The working group specifically can do country visits, or has done country visits around the world for the last 22 years, whereby it has spoken to people of African descent and actually derived views and their opinions from them about what cannot be done. It should be remembered that this is a little distinct because of the discrimination they face. They hardly have straightforward engagement with governments about their own issues. So the working group has had the privilege through country visits and also through public sessions, having also had a specific public session last year about principles for reparation. So there is an existing report about principles on reparation. It has also made strategic around the world about specific problems or cases that have arisen out of situations of people of African descent. And one of them has been the disproportionate incarceration of people of African descent in the Americans, especially men, and also intervened in a case in Switzerland where a 28-year-old boy had spent all his life in prison from 12 years old, and one of the main grounds was because of racism, race-based incarceration. Right, so the working group has been at the center of conceptualizing reparatory justice, and reparatory justice is seen both as a claim and an undertaking. A claim from the perpetrators to take responsibility, grounded on the international obligation to offer a remedy to victims of human rights violations. And also an undertaking whereby people of African descent themselves are undertaking measures to actually rid themselves of the consequences of the past. And with that, we see the renaming of public infrastructure and streets in South Africa, for example, in Uganda, the recent case, and what we have seen also in Burkina Faso and Mali. We are seeing curriculum reviews going on around the world. We see language policy reforms also taking place. we see also the African Union coming up with an encyclopedia on African history right now being done to also make sure that they convey the right African history to the world, because the narrative has always been based on from the perspective of the perpetrator. Right. The working group has also, in its operational guidelines on the inclusion of people of African descent, in the implementation of the SDGs, come up with what we may consider as racial justice indicators. What are those indicators or benchmarks that may indicate progress? And one has been visibilization of people of African descent and their concerns, their full participation and effective participation in matters that concern them, including leadership, mainstreaming and structuring and sustaining advances towards the inclusion of people of African descent in all spheres of life, bringing also to light intersectionalities and addressing them, monitoring and ensuring accountability of progress, paying attention to children of African descent, and reparation itself. We have observed that some countries have come up with policies or plans of action against racism, and these also include regional bodies. The African Union hasn't, but the European Union does. And that has instigated some countries within the European Union to address racism. We have asked some African countries to also come up with strategies against racism, and also sensitized from an academic perspective countries about the existence of racism on the African continent as well, which is an area that is quite sensitive with regard to a mandate that is repeated to the diaspora, but we have tried to actually bring that to light. Right. I'm pleased also to report that the working group has been very much at the center of the development of the discourse at the level of the African Union, and it was the penholder for Resolution 543 on Africa's reparations agenda and the human rights of people of African descent worldwide. And that was in 2022, which has contributed to the conversation and to where we are now with regard to the decade for reparation. This came from a perspective that the working group appreciated the stance of Africa as unique, having dealt with regions such as CARICOM, whose reparations program of action was actually endorsed by the working group before. So the working group noticed that Africa did not have one. So it made a call for the African continent to have its own agenda, including its own institutional structures, and also calling for the formation of the committee, which has pre-existed before, but called for its rejuvenation, and is pleased to have been invited to have a seat on that particular body. So we thank you very much and for this, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Namakuma, for your great contributions. I took note of the importance of going beyond the double standard perspective. It seems that when it comes to reparation vis-à-vis African countries, there are some agents which want to downplay the importance of what happened in the region. I also took note of the great contribution you made, including underlying the importance of intersectionality. And I thank you very much. We will come back to you soon during the Q&A. Ali Mazrui, one of the leading African thinkers, underlined how Africa should be apprehended in a very holistic perspective. And when it's come to reparation, it seems that we need to carefully look at instruments that the international law provides us to engage. And it's a great pleasure to give the floor to my colleague, Professor Fouad Zabiev from the Geneva Graduate Institute. Introduce you further. You can easily find details about Fouad, who is a probably one of the distinguished international lawyers of his, and I'm very pleased to have him with us this morning. Fuad, please.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, guests, visitors, and students. It's a great privilege and honor for me to be part of this high-level event, the importance of which goes beyond Africa and African peoples. It is a theme that is of importance to the international community and humanity at large. I am very grateful to my colleague and dear friend, Professor Eric Deguila, for his invitation and for associating me with this important event. So the title of this high-level event and the title of our panel makes a reference to international law specifically. They talk about contributions of international law. And I am here, obviously, in my capacity as professor of international law. So I want to say a few things about what international law can possibly offer. Professor Deguila made some important points in his introductory remarks. International law offers a framework for discussion about this important matter. It also comes in the form of some hurdles and obstacles, to which I will go in a moment. And I have to say that my task has been made easier by my fellow co-panelists, who have also spoken to some important aspects of international law relevant to this matter. Now, let me start with a broad point about international law when it comes to the matter that is the theme of this panel and the high-level event in general. I think we should keep in mind that the operating structures of international law came into being at a period in time when there was a great inequality among states. Some of the states, those we describe as part of the global south, were not independent and back then and did not take part in the making of international law. Now, obviously, that has left traces and consequences. And if you allow me, I want to offer you a statement from a great international lawyer from Mexico, who was a judge on the International Court of Justice, Judge Padillo Nervo, who specifically focused on the international law of state responsibility, to which I will come back in a moment. And he said something very important for our discussion today, which is the following: with state responsibility, international rules were established not merely without reference to small states, but against them, and were based almost entirely on the unequal relations between great powers and small states. And he made an invitation to international lawyers. He said, once international lawyers had abandoned the criterion of justice in assessing the conduct of states and reduced the systematization of law to a catalog of the practice of states, it was hardly surprising that the doctrine of state responsibility became a legal cloak for the imperialist interests of the international oligarchy during the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. I think it's important to keep that statement in mind. So international law, as I said, its operating structure that is with us today should be approached with that important caveat in mind. Now, I will start with one important hurdle that we heard about earlier, which is what is referred to as the doctrine of intertemporal law, which I would describe as an elephant in the room in every discussion by international lawyers about reparation for colonization and slavery and deportation. You're very likely to come across that terminology, doctrine of intertemporal law. Now, what it means basically was summarized by an international lawyer from Switzerland, public international lawyer Max Huber, in a case that was decided in 1928, the Island of Palmas arbitration case. So he fairly simply stated that a juridical fact must be appreciated in the light of the law contemporary with it, and not of the law in force at the time when a dispute in regard to it arises or falls to be settled. Now, I want us to take a pause and reflect about this statement. Basically, it's basically an invitation to be sensitive to the broad context, normative context surrounding any particular fact that we make an assessment about. I think it's important to bear in mind that this is a matter, what was the state of international law when colonization, deportation, and slavery and other atrocious acts were committed is something that calls for a fair amount of serious research. I don't think that we can simply reach the conclusion that international law back then was completely indifferent and actually permitted those acts without any impunity. But I think it's a completely different question we have to think about as well, which is, can we use the framework of international law today to describe the events that happened back then using the terminology that prevails today? And I submit to you that there is no rule in international law preventing us from doing it. And I will give you an example, by the way. We have an important instrument in international law called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. We know that it's an important treaty that was adopted by the UN, United Nations General Assembly in 1948. And we also know that the concept of genocide did not exist. The concept itself did not exist before it was offered by Raphael Lemkin, the famous Polish jurist, in a book he published in 1944. That's the reason, by the way, the Nuremberg Tribunal did not include in its indictments the crime of genocide. But if you take a look at the preamble of the Genocide Convention, it says something remarkable, which is often overlooked in the literature. It says, recognizing that at all periods of history, genocide has inflicted great losses on humanity. All periods of history, not making any distinction when it happened. I think that's a very important statement that we have to keep in mind. And for me, there is no hurdle or obstacle from using that using that concept in other concepts for slavery, deportation, or colonization, other concepts. I have a great quote from a philosopher who once asked whether we can describe some past events as genocide, even though the concept did not exist. And he said something brilliant. He said, one can in general assume that a concept can apply to some event only if at the time that the event occurred,